Hi, folks. Welcome again to another interview with Init 6. Daren Fulwell here, back with some really interesting folks talking about a topic that's very close to many network engineers' hearts at the moment, cloud networking. Would you like to introduce yourselves, folks?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Dana Yanch, and I'm a systems engineer, solutions architect, whatever you want to call me, for the cloud networking platform called Aviatrix.
Great stuff. Thanks, Dana.
Nice to meet you. I'm Eloise Kulapis, and I'm a network engineer for a large financial firm in the City of London. And my goal as a network engineer is to really, stay as relevant and learn as many relevant skills as I possibly can to stand out above my peers, and that includes knowing cloud.
Right, and it was through a conversation, Eloise, between us that you introduced me to Dana. Although I've known of you, Dana, for quite some time, because obviously you're historically not just a cloud person, right? You've got a very solid networking background. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's pretty fair. I started in networking back in 2007, which I wouldn't say, people usually say when they've been in networking for a long time, they're like, oh, when, IP first started, or, when people were moving from devnet to Ethernet. And I'm like, no, I started in the Ethernet world, so I'm not that old. But yeah, 2007, and I went down the whole Cisco Learning Academy path and got all the certifications that you think you should get as a traditional networking engineer. So CCIEs and CCDEs, and I focused quite a bit on LAN, WAN, data center networking, software-defined networking.
So good solid enterprise networking background then.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of data center architectures, and then more recently, I spent the last 6 years or so in the SD-WAN world, initially with a company called Abdel, which was then acquired by Cisco,
of course,
and worked for Cisco for some time.
Okay, I didn't realize you had the SD-WAN background as well. So that's an interesting, which I suppose leads nicely into where you are now. So we'll touch on that shortly, I suppose. But Eloise, your background from a networking perspective, how did you end up where you are?
Well, I started as like an IT support technician initially. I was an intern, and through that path, I became very interested in networking because I had to rack switches, I had to cable everything. I supported the application side, but I really became interested in networking when network engineers started kind of explaining quality of service to me. And I thought, wow, this is so cool. I really want to learn more.
Quality of service is so cool. That's wow.
Yeah, well, that's
extreme.
It was. And I started reading up, where can I learn? And it kind of took me on the path to Cisco, but I didn't have any money or any support really to get into that field. And then when I came to London, I was afforded the opportunity to start that journey, and really through hard work and perseverance and really pushing, doing a lot of self-study. Mm-hmm. But I think being in the right company, a combination of working hard and, being given the opportunity has afforded me that kind of that path. And so I've been a network engineer now for the last 4.5 years.
And I notice you're doing a lot of study and whatever, and certainly making noises in the community as well about devnet and about automation and those sorts of things, right? So
yeah, I think it became very clear to me very early on when I started my networking journey that automation is the way to go, and if I'm not going to learn those skills, I'm going to be left behind. Mm-hmm. And through that journey now, it kind of led me to, I've met Dana, and Dana kind of has introduced multi-cloud to me, and it's kind of like a no-brainer that's where I see myself going.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I mean, and it's a good point. I mean, we'll come back to this later, but I think the automation piece and the cloud networking piece, there's a real sort of synergy there, right? That makes everything start to be much more relevant. So we'll come back to that, because I think that's an important part of the cloud networking journey. But ultimately, I suppose, Dana, in terms of cloud networking, then what is it? Why is it that this is a different thing and something that people is, maybe misunderstood or whatever? What are your sort of, your mile high view of that? What is it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that people are still trying to figure out how to articulate properly. Even now, cloud has been around for half a decade. In the real world, half a decade. 5-6 years. It's been something that is starting to gain a lot of backwind, and people are starting to jump on board. But there's a huge difference between cloud networking and on-prem networking, and mainly it's because cloud networking is so remedial today compared to what we're used to doing on-prem with software-defined architectures and advanced segmentation and routing protocols, dynamic routing. A lot of that just doesn't exist natively in any cloud. And the problem that we're seeing is that as organizations are adopting cloud more seriously at such a rapid pace right now, that all those on-prem requirements, those complexities that existed on-prem that were solved by on-prem functionalities like dynamic routing and path selection and stuff like that, are now needed in the cloud, because it's not like we reinvent networking. Networking, IP is still IP, forwarding is still forwarding. It just now happens in more of a black box architecture where you don't have any visibility or control of it in the cloud. It provides you as a service.
I was just going to say, so what you're saying, you're consuming it, right? Rather than you're having to build it.
Yeah, with very little control and very little manageability, and at scale, it's hard to deal with. And so there's this push to cloud, and all the complexity is now moving to the cloud as well. And so we have to have the tools and functionality to do the same things we had on-prem, to have the same visibility, the same high availability, the same failover and path selection and traffic engineering and stuff.
So this is something actually that I've been thinking about a little, and it feels to me like you say the same, the same capabilities and the same levels of availability and those sorts of things. But ultimately, when you're talking about cloud, and you're talking about the migration of services into the cloud or applications into the cloud, you're talking about refactoring them, right? And making them work in such a way that they probably wouldn't have worked in the data center, or as network folk, we would have loved for them to have worked that way in the data center, because it would have made our lives a lot easier, right? So that transition brings with it changes in the actual requirements on the networking as well, right?
You're right.
Is that fair?
It's very fair. Yeah, there's actually mainly two main ways that we're seeing this happening. Either customers are lifting and shifting their applications to the cloud because the same apps that they were running on-prem have virtualized and have their same functionalities provided in marketplaces in the cloud, right? So they can just instantiate them as as instances now in the cloud. That's one way. That's not refactoring. That's not reformatting. That's not rebuilding the app. Other customers that are maybe more advanced have a larger DevOps team or a team that's more cloud aware, cloud educated. They may refactor their apps, rebuild them for something like containerization or Kubernetes and these types of things that are now available in the cloud for clustering and high availability and cloud scale architectures. So there's the two things that are happening. However, it doesn't change networking. Networking is still networking. And I try to make that very clear when whoever I talk to, is that you can go and try to simplify as much as you want by making things as a service in the cloud, but you add other complexities, you add other limitations, and that's all around losing control, losing visibility, and losing functionality, actually, when you try to oversimplify. So there's a kind of a balance that needs to be found. And I would say that initially, when people were first starting to adopt cloud, a lot of these advanced requirements didn't exist because the networking was remedial. I just need to connect point A to point B, maybe a couple VPCs, a couple VNets. Very rarely were you actually building, large enterprises in the cloud, doing multiple clouds, multiple regions, different types of apps, hundreds of thousands, maybe thousands of VPCs. That's where the complexity starts to show. And that's happening now because of the rapid adoption of cloud.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, Eloise, is this something that you've seen or in the organization you're in, or?
I think because of the type of organization that we are, like I mentioned before, I think in finance, this is something, there's a slower kind of adoption because of the type of data that you're dealing with. And there are actually large banks that are pushing to get their applications and their services into the cloud. And I think that's where cloud is interesting, and what has driven cloud is the fact that it's a business requirement. It's the business that is pushing these changes. I think I don't know what the future holds, and I don't know, because there's a certain risk, I suppose, in housing your data in the cloud. And those are all things that, financial institutions, choices that they have to make. So I don't, I've read a bit about compliance, and I think there's certainly from a compliance point of view, when it comes to financial data and certain types of data, it's not maybe that easy for a company like the one that I work for to take data from their clients and then house it somewhere that it's maybe not as safe, because it's not owned by us anymore, essentially, as Dana pointed out.
It's an interesting point that you made there about the fact that things change all the time. New capabilities are added, new requirements are placed on the infrastructure and so on. And I think this is probably the biggest thing from a cloud perspective. Dana, you said it yourself, right? Initially, people were just understanding how to glue these cloud environments into their networks. So there's that whole interaction with the on-prem network and the cloud, private cloud service, if you like, the VPC, the VNet, whatever.
Yeah.
But then as take-up continues, as things come along, new services are required, right? Because all of a sudden these things scale up, and you need transit gateways and virtual WAN and all of these other capabilities that come along. And it's like, right, okay.
Yeah.
It's a moving feast, right?
The complexity is compounding is the problem. So as you grow one cloud, one region, to multiple regions in a single cloud, and then to multiple clouds, and then from multiple clouds to multiple regions per multiple cloud, the complexity is compounding. All these clouds do everything differently. And you mentioned one thing, the on-ramp to cloud, getting to cloud. That's what we've kind of been working on for the last 4 or 5 years. People are like wondering, well, how do I most efficiently get to my resources from all my data centers and all my remote sites to the cloud? That's been solved for years. Like, we have all sorts of ways to do that, right? Direct connects and VPNs. We have SD-WAN. We have private connects through things like Equinix and PurePort. Like, that's been solved. It's all orchestrated, automated. The complexity now is networking within the cloud and networking between clouds and networking to partners or other environments outside of the cloud. Okay, so that's where the complexity lies, and that's where if you're saying I'm a cloud networker or I'm going into cloud networking, that's where you're focusing your time on, not how to connect it to on-prem. Like, there's all sorts of ways to do that. It's super easy nowadays.
I mean, ultimately, that is just extending of the campus and the enterprise network, isn't it? Which is hopefully the familiar bit of what we're talking about in terms of
that's where you get to play with a BGP, right? Things that we're used to doing, right? Yeah, that's simple. It's VPNs, it's BGP. Sometimes it's a private connection. That stuff is not a problem. It's like I said, how do we bring things like segmentation in a seamless manner to the cloud, and segmentation that works with all clouds, that you don't have to redesign for every cloud you go into. Same thing for transitive networking. One good example of this is that you might have had maybe 10 VPCs in a couple of regions, and you just would create a bunch of peering relationships to them. That's easy, right, between each other so they can talk. But what if you start to get 30, 40, 50 VPCs, and then 30, 40, 50 VNets across different accounts and subscriptions? You need them all to have an agnostic transitive architecture. That's where you start to hit your head on the wall, because you're like, well, I don't know a way to do this easily. There's solutions for that nowadays.
Yeah,
I work for one.
I was just going to say, well, we will no doubt cover some of that as we progress, but just want to dig a little more into the actual cloud elements of that. The thinking about the VPCs, thinking about the VNets, I suppose. I mean, I'm and I'm falling into the same trap as everybody else does, because obviously AWS and Azure are the only clouds, right? Yeah, okay. but obviously they're the biggest examples. As a network guy, you need to know the detail of how those things work, right? Because ultimately, service gets delivered, and as someone who's managing and maintaining that network, you need to understand all of the. I mean, this comes back to Eloise, to what you were saying about the applications, right? And how the applications interact with the network. You talked about QoS. Well, it's as much about load balancing and routing generally from your clients to your servers, and all of that stuff is still relevant. But obviously now we're taking that a step further, because we need to understand that in a very alien environment. What does that look like?
Yeah, those architectures are still relevant. I'll make a point here. However, they don't translate. It's not, you don't just take your DMZ style environment that you're used to doing in campus environments or data centers and just translate directly to cloud. Because cloud is in its infancy, and anything in its infancy poses limitations, you now have to design around all these limitations, right? And so it's not like you can't just copy and paste your architectures to the cloud. It doesn't work. You're setting yourself up for failure. You have to start from scratch. You have to relearn all the limitations across all these different clouds. And how do I re-architect this to provide the same functionality or the same level of functionality for the application to thrive as it did on-prem, now in the cloud? And you need the tools and functions for that.
So give me an example. I mean, I'm thinking security, right? Imagine securing a data center back in the day where you'd have had a firewall and a whole load of segments, and you'd push everything through that firewall, and it would sit between the segments and do its thing.
Yeah,
that's not the same in cloud, right?
No, you could do that on-prem because you had access to all the actual layer 2, layer 3. You can manipulate routing to your will. You could run routing protocols. You can make your firewall layer 3. You can make it layer 2 transparent. You can implement different virtual routers. Like, you could do all sorts of things because you had 100% control on routing and switching on-prem.
What you're talking about there is being able to guide the traffic to a point where you can do that thing, right?
Service insertion is what we would call it, right? Service insertion on-prem was easy because you had 100% of the keys to unlock all the features you need to attract the traffic to the right VRFs or the right segments or the right egress points in the data center or in the campus LAN. You had that functionality. Yeah. You have almost 0% of that. You have maybe 5% of that functionality and that manipulation, that control natively in any cloud. And so, well, now you're wondering, well, how do I insert my firewall, my next generation, my Palo Alto, my Fortinet, my checkpoints, my Cisco ASA, whatever it is, what do they call them? Firepower, I guess, nowadays, in the cloud, in this, not in the same way, but in a way to provide the same level of
functionality,
visibility, control, and security. And so to do that today natively, very little of it is orchestrated. It's very manual. It's tedious. It's actually quite complex because there's all these components that you don't control that you have to somehow glue together. And you do that let's say you do that in AWS. You figure out how to do it with the TGW in AWS, all that service insertion, manual nonsense. Well, now you got to figure out, well, how do I do this in Azure when I move to Azure? How do I do this in Alibaba? How do I do this in OCI and Google? It's different across all of them. There's no parity in how to do it. And so it's just it's compounding complexity, as I mentioned earlier.
And compare and contrast, I suppose, with using different, I would say using different vendors, but ultimately from an on-prem perspective, a network is a network, whether it's a Cisco network or a Juniper or an Arista or whatever. It's still a network, and it's still built using the same principles. What we're talking about, I suppose, here is you'd have to imagine it like an overlay network, right? It probably is an overlay network, but I guess we just will never know because they're not going to tell us that, are they? Because we consume it, and that's it. So ultimately, what you've got is a network that's as flat as it needs to be, and you have no insertion point as such in order to put stuff in there, unless you have to really jump through hoops, right? If you want to do it in that way.
you have to use their, so when I say their, you have to either use the security vendors or the cloud vendors' rigid architectures to insert, right? They'll give you a couple options. Earlier, in the early days of inserting services in the cloud, those rigid architectures posed ridiculous limitations around visibility and throughput and HA. Right? Like you could only have one firewall active. You could only have it in one AZ, or you'd have to run BGP, or you'd have to do source NAT and lose visibility. There's like all these limitations. Now that cloud networking is becoming more mature, I would say it's still in its infancy, but it's becoming more mature. They're starting to figure out ways to provide insertion as a service now, using new features like AWS gate, the load balancing functionality, the gateway load balancer, the application load balancer, things like that to insert. But it's still
ultimately then this functionality then appears in the overlay, and so you don't actually have these restrictions of having to funnel all the traffic to a particular point in order to deal with it, in order to pass it on. It just happens automatically as part of the passing of traffic.
Most of the time, what people were doing was they're like, okay, there's too many limitations in the cloud to insert my firewall. I'm just going to pump the traffic back down to on-prem, put it the firewall on the edge, and then put it back up, which is like the most suboptimal architecture, and it's ridiculous. It's like the ugliest architecture. As a network architect, as you know, and you guys would know, you'd never do that anymore, right? But now we have ways to do this in the cloud in more graceful with more graceful architectures that are non-native. The native side of things are still catching up on how to make this user-friendly, how to provide the same functionality and visibility. They're still catching up.
But to some extent, the native capability is the native capability, but it's not going to be compatible with another provider and another provider, provider. Same way that vendors have that have always had, even when they're using standards. Interoperability issues, right? So ultimately,
let me give you an example of this, a very good one. So let's say you try to insert a Palo Alto next generation firewall, either for east-west or north-south or internet egress inspection in your cloud, right in the cloud, right? Not on-prem. Okay, in AWS, okay, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, it's still a pain, but you set up your next generation firewall virtual appliance. You give it certain interfaces. You put those interfaces in certain subnets that are attached to certain route tables, and now you can figure out how to manipulate routing per interface per route table. Okay, great, you can do that. Now you can go to GCP, and GCP is like, oh, every one of your interfaces has to go into a completely different VPC. Right, and it's a global VPC. It's not a regional thing, and so like the whole mentality of your architecture that you had on AWS is like blown away. Like, oh, that's not going to work.
With the same vendor firewall.
Exactly, and the same thing happens in Azure. It's completely different. In Azure, I have to use a load balancer and all these other things.
Don't start me on that one. That's amazing.
Unreal. The thick. If you look at the documentation, nobody looks at paper documentation anymore, but if you look at the PDF thickness, right, the amount of virtual pages, it's insane. The amount of time you spend.
Don't print it, folks.
The amount of time you spend trying to instantiate, do service insertion. That's one example. Go try to do that for things like advanced routing or multiple ingress egress points or insertion of other functions like load balancing. There needs to be a more intelligent way to do this, and there is, right? And
that's just led so nicely on, hasn't it, to the next step. So obviously there needs to be some way of I can't get away from saying overlay, because it is ultimately an overlay that interfaces with all of those elements to bring it all together, I guess.
Yeah, and we're all used to overlays, right? I think most of us have been working with overlays for the last 15 years. If you're in the WAN space, you did DMVPN, right?
Yeah.
And then you migrated to SD-WAN overlays, and maybe you looked at LAN overlays with things like SD access or ACI. NSX, right? These are all overlays. And why overlays exist is because they provide so much more functionality than the base layer that they're running on, right? So much more visibility, so much more security, so much more automation, orchestration that's why overlays exist, and they have a place in the cloud too. And that's the company I work for. We are the premier overlay solution for cloud networking.
So ultimately, what you're talking about there then is being able to reach into the cloud constructs to provide connectivity from them, but then bringing that up into an overlay which can connect to multiple different cloud environments, segmented however it needs to be, secured however it needs to be, and I guess back into the enterprise as well, right? Into the on-prem network.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so, I mean, you're kind of, it's a good segue into talking about what the solutions are, right? We talked a lot about the problems. The solution, as you're mentioning here, is an overlay, but it's not just an overlay like DMVPN, we have to manually build it, or ACI, where it's still relatively complex to manipulate and manage. There, you need more of a controller-based overlay architecture that simplifies what's happening across these clouds, but doesn't provide an abstraction to the point where you lose features and functionality and visibility. Again, there's this beautiful balance that what us at Aviatrix are so focused on, where we're obsessed with finding this balance between native functionality and overlay functionality, marrying them together and making sure that customers can leverage native where they need to leverage native, and then leverage overlay functionality, advanced functionality from Aviatrix, for example, where they need that, right? And so it's that balance, we found it, and that's why we found success as well in this market.
But then that's always the issue, isn't it? With any of these things is any overlay has to have a target consumer but then it has to have a network that sits underneath it as well, that also has to be managed and owned and whatever. So the balance is I guess not being too leaky between the layers, but providing the right services to the people who need to consume it. So ultimately.
That's a good point. Yeah, you don't want to have, I mean, if you're throwing an overlay on top of something that's already relatively annoying to manipulate, manage, you don't want to have another annoying thing to deal with on a daily basis. And that's, of course, again, forefront of mind for us. When you're building anything with Aviatrix, our overlay solution, we're going to handle all that plumbing, all that manipulation, all that remedial stuff that you'd be doing in the cloud, like building VPCs, building connections, configuring route tables, subnets, all that stuff, load balancers, manipulating the traffic with the native contracts. The controller handles all that for you, so you don't have to worry about it. Right. And then all you're worrying about are the Aviatrix advanced functionalities that you're trying to leverage, like overlapping CIDR, NAT functionality, advanced routing, path manipulation with things like BGP in the cloud, segmentation, service insertion. It's fully orchestrated for you. Like that's the things that you'd be working on a daily basis.
So it's interesting. So I'm going to just shift gears a little. You talked there a lot about the controller and about the orchestration and so on. So obviously as clouds become more prevalent, so people have understood that in order to use those cloud services, whether that's the cloud native or whether that's the overlay technologies deployed across them, everything's through APIs, right? Everything's through, even when you log into the console is just accessing the API at the back end. Things take a little time because that's what, these aren't immediate things, because there's orchestration that sits behind them and all those good things like idempotency and blah, 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 all that we learn, as network folk coming into this, we're sort of learning about these ideas.
Yes.
But this for me, I think is probably the biggest change in some ways with the cloud operations, that it's actually forcing the issue with automation and programmability and this thing, because in order to use these things, you have to consume APIs. You have to be in a position where you're able to do that. And so this comes back to what we were talking about before, Eloise, about the programmability piece, right? All of a sudden, it puts a whole load more context into the fact that we've all got to learn this stuff, right? Because otherwise, we're not going to be able to consume this cloud magic.
And support it. And I think that's, I think if you think of what is the network operations team of the future, what is that going to look like? It's, listening to you guys talk, it's clear how Aviatrix kind of fills that gap. You were speaking about native kind of capabilities versus, what you're consuming from the cloud. And I think, for me, when I listen to you, I would be interested to ask you the solutions that you have built for your customers. And if you think about, the needs of your customers, how has Aviatrix and multi-cloud affected their operational teams? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that question. And it's one I like to answer because it's a journey that I had to go through myself, going from the on-prem world where I did little to no automation. If anything, I was taking other people's scripts, Python scripts or whatever, and just manipulating it and running it on my own, right? To the point where I have to really understand how to orchestrate and automate different native and Aviatrix components with some sort of tool, some sort of abstraction for automation. And we'll talk about that here. One thing I want to mention is Terraform and how important that is to know. Yeah. And so real quick, just a little background, as cloud networking and cloud architectures became more common, these cloud service providers offered really robust and nice ways to orchestrate their functions. Their APIs are very well documented, and you could pretty much do anything you wanted, even more with the API than you could by clicking around. And people get sick of clicking, right? You could build everything you want with clicking on AWS console, Azure console. After a while, you're like, oh man, I need to figure out a simple way.
Give me a CLI. Yeah.
Yeah, I need to be able to make this repetitive, in a repetitive way and make it easy to consume. And so they made that easy, and they did this whole API as a service, and it's super simple to manipulate. The issue though that we find is that now if you do multiple clouds, you now have to figure out the APIs across these different clouds. And so then you have this abstraction layer like Terraform. And so Terraform simplifies a lot of this. You can Terraform out, you use a provider. So all these different CSPs act as providers, and they offer their own Terraform modules and Terraform code that really simplify how to deploy certain things, right? You don't have to really understand coding to figure it out. It's pretty straightforward English. You read it as English type thing. But again, now you got to figure out, well, how do I unify that across these different clouds? And so, and to answer your question, Eloise, Aviatrix has solved that by providing a unified API or target for you to manipulate all clouds. And so, because you're building an Aviatrix architecture that provides parity and the same architecture across all these different clouds, you now have a single API you can code against. And not only is it a single API, it's a single Terraform provider. So you can use the Aviatrix Terraform provider to code against our platform, and then we'll go figure out the complexity of APIs across the different clouds to build out certain things. Right? So it's kind of another additional abstraction.
I was going to say it's two layers of abstraction.
Well, that's great, because that kind of takes that kind of the pane of glass that comes into with orchestration, that takes it down to like the automation layer, which is incredible. No, that's fascinating.
You're going to have to learn some automation.
I was just going to say.
Yeah, you're going to have to learn some automation if you're doing cloud networking, just because people are not going to want to wait on you to, if you're a network architect, network engineer is building out networking in the cloud, nobody's going to want to sit there and wait on you to click to build these different environments. For POCs or for small environments, that's okay. But as you scale out, it doesn't work. What happens is that you become this network cabler for the cloud, right? I mean, nothing against network cablers. We need them. Network cablers exist for a reason, and they're really good at what they do, and they make things connect and talk, right? But there comes a point where you want to graduate past cabling in your career. And so if you're stuck doing everything in the manual way in the cloud, whether that's through clicking through consoles or not orchestrating and automating things, you're relegating yourself to being a network cabler for the cloud. And it's really, you're worth a lot more than that. Your skills are worth a lot more than that. Let some intelligent platform do all that infrastructure cabling for you, like Aviatrix, an intelligent controller, and then you should be doing all the more important things that make your business money, right? The more advanced functions in the cloud.
I mean, the other aspect to that, I suppose, is that everyone else who's actually deploying the applications in the cloud are already automating and building their stuff in that way.
Yeah,
They
you don't
don't
want
want to
to
be
lag.
waiting. They don't want to be waiting for the network guy, like has always been the way, right? The raise an ITIL request for a network to be created, and 3 months later, once all the network kit's been provisioned, and then you can configure your VLAN. And
why do you think devs left the on-prem world years before networking people did? It's because they got sick of waiting for us to do our job, right? They're like, I can do that in 2 seconds in the cloud.
That's absolutely it, isn't it? I mean, the whole where did shadow IT come from? The whole point was that the people were fed up of waiting to develop stuff. They just wanted to go and do it.
Yep.
No, I was going to say there's all kind of conversations about cost and stuff around that, but hey, that's one for someone else to worry about, right?
I think as a network engineer, my question would also be, there's so many different cloud providers, and I suppose that something that Aviatrix solves, and maybe it will solve it, even in a better way. Maybe there's something that I don't know that but if you look at jobs going in the networking space, they ask you to have AWS, they ask you to have Google Cloud, they ask you to have Azure. You've got to be like a networking guru on top of that. On top of that, you've got to know your automation skills, and it's like you have to be a superhero. You have to know everything. How do you think a product like Aviatrix solves that for a network engineer?
Great question. And again, I can use an example of myself, because when I joined Aviatrix, this was about 2 years ago. When I joined, all I knew was AWS networking at a basic level, a very basic level. And I was scared out of my mind joining this company full of cloud gurus, super cloud people, right? And I was used to being the guru, right? And then I joined this company where I'm bottom of the totem pole. I don't know what I'm doing here. But the way I picked it up was a couple things. Well, I actually didn't go through any formalized training like I usually would. Like I would go through a network academy or some sort of courses, Coursera, Cloud Guru, something like that. Initially, I had to get this thing going quickly. They're not going to give me time to ramp up, right? I'm jumping on customer calls. I'm being a trusted advisor for customers immediately. And so I learned trial by fire. But at the same time, the way I figured it out was by leveraging Aviatrix's controller, building it out using a controller, because anybody can pick up the Aviatrix platform and run with it. You don't need to know how to do any cloud. It's basic networking mentality. So if you've done networking before, jump on the controller, start deploying things. It's super simple. But what I would do is I would deploy first with Aviatrix, which abstracted all the complexity. Then I would go back behind the scenes and look at what did it do? What did it build? How did it build the subnets? How did it configure the routing? How did it connect these two networks together? And I would figure out that, I reverse engineer it basically. And so I was able to pick up, GCP, Oracle, Azure, and AWS, the cloud, the differences between all the networking in them and how to configure that stuff manually, just by reverse engineering what Aviatrix built out for me. So we make that really simple for anybody to consume and understand.
That's it's a great approach. I mean, this is always going to be the problem, right? Is how you learn so much about so many different things and what that process looks like. I mean, we, as Eloise rightly points out, recent years it just feels like there's more and more and more that network folk have to learn. So
it's never ending. It's never ending, but this is also why we have good jobs. So
right, I love it. I mean, it's keeps me young. That's what I claim anyway. But when you were talking, Dana, before about going back as far as 2000 and something, and it's like, there's a conversation there I don't want to get into because I do remember that being able to hear packets sort of traversing cables and that sort of thing. So
it's Daren, don't worry, I'm starting to feel how you feel. Initially, especially in the cloud world, I'm 34 now, and I used to be the young guy, whenever I would enter a conversation or be part of a project, I was the young guy. I would have to prove myself out. it's like now in cloud, the young people are in their early 20s and they're damn good at this stuff. All right. And so I'm trying to compete and be, and be up there with these people. Like, no, I'm going to go into full management here soon. I don't want
to. No. You really don't. I mean, that's an interesting point though, because does that mean then that to be damn good at the cloud networking stuff and all the rest of it, that you don't need all of that legacy networking experience or understanding or knowledge?
You really don't. No, you really don't. And Eloise and I had a conversation about this for her blog. She asked me, if you're starting to get into this industry and you're trying to figure out where do I start, what should I learn, which courses should I go through? I told her, if she asked me this 2 years ago, before I joined the cloud side of things, I would say, oh yeah, go through and get your ccna, your ccnp, your cci, become really good at networking, and then you can branch out into other stuff and you'll be a specialist, right? I would say that my mindset has shifted completely. I would say a lot of the stuff that you will learn in your basic networking classes and then your advanced networking things like CCIE and CCD, all that stuff, it's not really relevant now in the cloud. It's really not. So what I found was relevant are the basics. Mm-hmm. If you're really good at the fundamentals of networking, then you'll understand and translate that to how they're trying to accomplish networking in the cloud, because the concepts are still relevant. But like all the advanced BGP and MPLS and MPBG, all that stuff that you're using, it's not relevant. So I would recommend, if you want to be in an industry that's really hot right now, that pays really well, and be valued in that role, learn your networking, go do your CCNA, maybe your CCNP if you have the time for it, but then jump straight into cloud. Go straight into all these amazing courses that are offered online, Cloud Guru, all these different ones of INE, they all have these different cloud courses. Go and specialize on that stuff. Because then after you figure out the cloud piece, you're going to go and figure out the automation piece. And you're going to go figure out the application piece. And you put it all together, you're a well-rounded cloud architect. You can ask for what your pay is. So you can say, I want this much, and the company will pay it. I'm not even lying.
Wait, where do I sign up for this? I'm clearly there's a boat.
I'm not like Dana. I was gonna, this is the kind of cool information I was gonna get.
This is like that. I remember back in the day, a CCIE could write their own ticket, right? They could say, this is how much I expect to be paid. And then a company would say, well, you're a CCIE. We're going to pay you that. It's not like that anymore. It's like you have to fight for your value with that traditional networking role, versus in cloud. If you're a cloud expert and you have a very well-rounded cloud set of skills, you're back to that same world where I'm rare. I know what I'm worth. Companies know what I'm worth. They're going to pay me what I asked them to pay me. And that my life, what I've been able to ask for compensation wise from companies that are trying to poach me from Aviatrix, it's like unreal. I'm like, I thought I'd never get paid that much, but I guess I am valued because there's so few people who know this stuff.
You've already converted me. No. I can hear exactly what you're saying. I mean, as an old guy, all right, I always think, but what about all the stuff that's not in the cloud, and what about this and what about that? And I think for me, all of those things come together and influence each other, right? So I hear what you're saying about IE and all the rest of it. If you're going to focus on cloud, then there's very little benefit to it, and I understand that. I think if you're a network, if you're trying to be a network guru, then I think there is still that path, and you still take that path. I think the DE was an interesting one for me, and I don't know how you feel about this, but for me, I think the breadth of what's in there, and certainly looking at the new version of the DE, and the way that's reaching out even further into other technologies and bringing those together. I think that rewards the breadth of focus rather than the depth in a specific thing, because it's all about, and that that fits more neatly, I think, with what you're describing for the cloud perspective, because you're basically you're saying, look, I know networking, I understand networking in all of its shapes and forms, but I can also understand and appreciate what it means to automate stuff, and what it means to operate an IT infrastructure, and what it means to run an application and prove that its service is being delivered correctly, and all of that stuff. And I think that is ultimately where we're going here, right? What we're trying to say is, you're not going to need to care how the bits get from one place to another. What you're going to need to care about is how your applications are going to sit on top of this thing, and how you then make sure that that service is always there. So you need to worry about DNS, and you need to worry about load balancing, and you need to worry about.
You need to have a bigger picture of networking, right? I always feel like as broad as the CCIE's blueprint is, it's still super narrow.
Super narrow, of course
it's
it is.
Still, right?
By definition, it's that.
Yeah, exactly. And I like that you mentioned the CCDE, because it was the opposite. When they came out with the CCDE, it was super broad to the point where you had no idea what the hell to study for that. Right? So many of us failed over and over again. So
absolutely. And even now, the pass rate is so low for exactly that reason, because everyone goes, oh, and I didn't understand this type of MPLS interoperability. And it's like, really? That is not going to make the difference. What's going to make the difference is understanding when someone asks for a certain uptime of an application, what that actually means. But
I would say I don't regret any of those certifications. I know I'm coming across as kind of like a hater, like a legacy certification hater, but I was the poster child for the Network Academy for a long time initially, because I came straight out of high school, went directly into Networking Academy, and did my bang CCNA, 2 CCIEs, a CCD, all through the Network Academy programs, right? And so I was like their poster child, and now I feel like I've shifted, because it's just because of the way your career goes, right? You change your focus, and you start to realize, okay, there's different things I need to learn about, and I need to change the way I operate, right?
And technical knowledge is definitely what kind of set you up for where you are now. So, I think those things are still valuable.
Very valuable, yeah.
And for me, it's that thing, isn't it, of being open to learn new things, even when you're as old and grey as me, and being able to just always shift and change and look at the big picture. And for me, I've been doing this quite a while. So let's say 30 years and leave it there. What I take from what I've done is the same as you. I did the whole Novell thing before I even started with the wires and the packets, right? And then I did those stuff, and I've taken something from every part of that, right back to the days when I used to support desktop PCs that weren't even connected to a network, and you used to run WordPerfect on it and write macros. Right, but there's relevance to that, because there was an expectation of how an application would perform when someone sat in front of the computer. And so if you have that understanding that people expect and have an expectation of what they're doing, then you can understand how everything you do impacts that. And I think that's really key. Sorry.
No, it's fine. To Eloise's point around the background I had and how it's helped me, I would say that it's given me a leg up when I'm learning new things in the cloud, because again, networking is networking. It's just it's obfuscated sometimes, or it's maybe manipulated a little bit, but the basics, the fundamentals still exist. And if you have a very strong understanding of fundamentals, which you will by going through these certification tracks, legacy certification tracks, you can then translate that to helping you understand how cloud networking is occurring. So I would say you're right, Eloise. I had a leg up. I was able to pick up these different cloud networking constructs and how they operate quicker than a non-networking person, because it just clicks faster, because you understand that's how networking is done, right? But I would say it wouldn't be a detriment to somebody who's just starting in this industry if they didn't go through all that networking stuff initially. They would be just as successful, in cloud networking. I guarantee.
And I think you can argue that for pretty much any path, because ultimately things change, right? And you always have to be able to adjust to how they're changing. So long as you're open, and so long as you're focused and able to learn, then I suspect ultimately, it's then down to aptitude and
what you're passionate about, and
yeah,
how your mind works. To me, automation is just a natural. My mind thinks in that kind of process way. So it very much, and this is one thing that Dana and me in our previous conversation is, you need to understand what your strengths are, and you need to hone in on that and focus on that and build on that. And you need to know what you like, and if then you can build on that. So, and I mean, for me it was networking, and then I realized, well, that's not going to pay me in the next 5 years, so you've got to adjust. You've got to be flexible as well.
Yeah, Eloise, you're about to experience this in the real world, because I know you went through the DevOps certifications for Cisco just recently, and you learned a lot through that. And now you're about to go through the Aviatrix Certified Engineering courseware, right? The courses, the associate, the professional. We have several different courses, and you're going to find that you'll pick up the automation components of those courses much faster than I would have if I was in the same position as you earlier, right? Or any one of us who don't have an automation background, we're going to struggle on that side of things, right? So this is great. You're going to experience exactly what we've been talking about here, how you're going to have a leg up on that side of it.
Exactly. I see that already. I think that's where Cisco is great with their certifications, is they know exactly which skills to bring together within a certification that will benefit you, not just in one specific role, but in many related roles. And I see that, it's a devnet, which focuses on networking, but really you can translate it into DevOps, whether you can take those skills into the cloud as well.
And yeah, I mean, because ultimately that the cloud is what's brought us into this. If you, in my view, is that the transition to cloud from an IT perspective, generally, IT operations, has meant that automation has done all those things that Dana talked about before, about accelerating infrastructure and being able to provision and build applications quicker and so on, while everyone was waiting for the network. And so we're just catching up. But it's all down to this idea of this transition, this adoption of cloud, ultimately, from an operational point of view, I think. So we have cloud to thank, I guess, for the fact that Cisco have realized that this is where we need to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Folks, we've been blathering on for a full hour now, which is quietly impressive. I just wonder if you've got any other questions or any other sort of closing thoughts, maybe.
I think, from me, on the platform that I kind of house, if you want to put it like that, I get a lot of questions about Aviatrix, what benefit it would be for people's careers, and I try to answer it as best as I can. But in your words, even if you had to take Aviatrix out of it and just think of it as a multi-cloud and how important that is for someone who's interested in networking, how would you, express that to people?
Yeah, I would say first of all, don't pigeonhole yourself. Don't call yourself, I'm an AWS guy, or I'm an Azure guy, or, the same way you wouldn't say, I'm a Cisco switching guy.
Yeah.
Or gal. I'm sorry, Eloise, I should say guy or gal. Whenever I say a guy, it's like unisex, but kind of like my name, I'm Dana. It could be a boy or a girl, right? But the whole point here is that you don't want to pigeonhole yourself at any point in your career, and that includes when you're going to cloud. I know you might start in AWS, but don't stop in AWS. You should be then learning AWS, go to Azure, go to GCP, go to Oracle, go to Alibaba, and get your skills broadened. Because the truth of the situation here is that multi-cloud is a reality. It's not fun and games anymore. Most organizations started in a single cloud in AWS, for example, and then the business, as you mentioned earlier, Eloise, is forcing these organizations to move into other clouds, Why? There's a lot of reasons, right? There's a whole list of them, but the main ones being, well, they don't want all their eggs in one basket, for example. Why would you? Like, does any one organization in the world buy only Cisco and never anything else? Or only Juniper and nothing else? No, you want to buy best of breed for your organization, the best firewalls, the best LAN side, the best wireless. It might be Aruba with Cisco switches, with F5 load balancers and Fortinet firewalls. That's customers want best of breed so that their organizations are running at peak, right? It's the same things happening now in the cloud. The organizations don't want to put all their eggs in one basket. From a HA perspective or from a risk perspective, risk averse, being adverse to risk, or they want best performing functionalities. They want certain apps in one cloud and other apps in another cloud because of how they operate better. Like ML apps work better in Google. For example, database apps work better in Azure. Front-end apps work better in AWS, right? So this is the whole point here is that multi-cloud is being driven by business decisions, and you should not pigeonhole yourself. You got to go learn them all, right? The same way you learned everything on-prem.
I guess, as from my perspective on the outside looking in, what I see is that different services, right, that each of the cloud providers have suit different use cases, which I suppose is exactly what you're describing there, isn't it? It's you've got a great CDN in this particular environment, or you might have a particularly strong DNS in another, or your load balancing and so on. And it's really about understanding how best to deliver the application that you're trying to deliver to whoever it is you're trying to deliver it to, and then appreciating which cloud is the most appropriate, in which case you end up with a mixture. Yeah,
Daren, it's very rarely a technical reason why people are doing multi-cloud. It's out of 99% of the time, it's out of our decision making, realm of decision making. It's the business said, okay, well, we have better deals with this one, or we have a customer that doesn't want us running their app that we're serving to them in that cloud because it's a competitor cloud or something like that, right? So there's always going to be some.
I've heard that one.
There's always going to be some external and internal driving force for you to be multi-cloud, and
it's CCDE stuff back here, right? It's that whole kind of like, don't just think about technical. You've got to consider what's easiest to support, where you're, what financially, and so all that good stuff.
Exactly. And then and for a whole different conversation, Eloise, we can go through, maybe Daren, we can have another talk about what are a lot of the solutions to these problems. We've posed a lot of problems in this conversation, but we have only just touched on the solutions. The solutions are where it gets really, really interesting. How do we solve this gracefully?
Yeah, I would love to hear some of the solutions that you've built.
Yeah, that's why AVHX exists. We've been the leading solution provider for single cloud and multi-cloud networking for 6 years, and we're continuing to forge these paths that are becoming more and more important today for organizations.
Awesome. Guys, I am going to call it there, and I just used the word guys. Apologies again, Eloise. If people want to find out more about you as individuals or whatever, are you guys on social media? Are they accessible, Eloise?
I'm on Twitter as DevNet Queen, on Instagram DevNet Queen. My blog is DevNet Queen. I'm sure you will tag.
There's a theme here, right?
Yeah, and I'm on LinkedIn as well, Eloise Kulapis. So you're welcome to reach out.
Great stuff, thank you. Dana, is there anywhere where you would like people to contact you?
Yeah, I'm really on LinkedIn for the most part. I do cross post to Twitter, but mainly it's whatever I post on LinkedIn. I'm on TikTok if you want to go find me on TikTok. I don't. All my TikToks are hockey related because I'm a big hockey guy, but they're not networking related. If you want to go watch.
So there's my closing title sorted right there. That's all good.
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, just Dana Yanch, and then I'll pop up. I'm the only Dana Yanch in the world.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
I'm not the only Daren. No, I think I am the only Daren Fulwell in the world as well. So I'll take that
as well. So
Three unique characters in one conversation. What can I say? Listen, folks, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate the you hanging around for this call. We will definitely talk more, and I'll be in touch with you both to line that up. But for now, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Daren. Nice
Thank
to
you.
see you.
Great stuff.
Thank you, everybody.